Russia believed it could strike Kyiv without facing consequences, but it was gravely mistaken. Within hours, an entire city inside its own territory collapsed, plunged into blackouts and chaos. This counterattack took place on September 29th, and it revealed something unprecedented. For the very first time, American precision weapons crossed the border and struck deep into the heart of Russia. But before we can understand this historic counterattack, we need to go back a few hours and look at what happened in Kyiv. In 2025, Russia abandoned large-scale ground offensives and shifted its focus to airstrikes. And in the early hours of September 29th, it launched one of the largest waves since the start of the war. Nearly 500 Shahed drones, accompanied by more than 40 cruise missiles, advanced against the Ukrainian capital. Air defenses managed to intercept most of them, but not all. Debris and explosions struck residential neighborhoods, destroying buildings and vehicles. Dozens were injured and innocent civilians were killed, including a 12-year-old girl. Just a few hours later came the response. President Volodymyr Zelensky declared that Ukraine would no longer remain only on the defensive and promised that Russia would feel a blackout in its own capital. That statement marked the announcement of a new posture. And it was in this context that the Ukrainians chose their target, the Russian city of Belgorod. Located less than 40 kilometers from the border, it is not only an important logistical hub, but also depends on two critical facilities: the local thermal power plant and a substation that keeps much of the region connected to the grid. Neutralizing these structures meant paralyzing basic services and plunging the city into chaos. Russia wanted to punish Kyiv with missiles and drones, but ended up watching its own infrastructure collapse. In just a few minutes, the city was plunged into massive blackouts. The targeted thermal power plant went offline, and the electrical substation was critically damaged. Entire streets lost power, the subway stopped, transportation systems froze, and even the water supply was cut off. For residents, the feeling was one of total collapse. Elevators stuck with people inside, dark supermarkets, ATMs out of service, and unstable communications. Belgorod, a city of more than 300,000 inhabitants, simply came to a halt. Images that circulated showed huge lines at gas stations. It was the first time that the war, so close to the border, had struck the heart of the city with such intensity. The governor of Belgorod, Vyacheslav Gladkov, confirmed that the city had been targeted by Ukrainian missiles and drones. But, as has become routine, he tried to downplay the damage. In his statement, he described the episode as a terrorist attack and claimed that services were under control. He also said that hospitals and police stations were operating thanks to emergency generators, an attempt to project calm that, in reality, only highlighted the severity of the situation. While Kyiv described it as a legitimate military response against infrastructure used in Russia's war effort, Moscow pushed the narrative that civilians were the primary targets. The propaganda was clear: turn the attack into a victimhood argument to justify new bombings against Ukraine. But the difference between the two sides is striking. Russia has been launching missiles and drones against residential buildings, schools, and even maternity wards. Ukraine, in this case, targeted strategic energy infrastructure, indirect military targets that sustain the Kremlin's war logistic. After the collapse in Belgorod, the question circulating in military backrooms was direct: what took down the city's power grid so quickly and so precisely? By cross-referencing timelines, crater patterns, and the type of damage to transformers and substation yards, analysts reached a consistent technical conclusion. It was not just a swarm of drones, but long-range weapons guided by GPS and INS, designed for pinpoint strikes. The damage signature indicates high explosive charges applied with submeter precision against critical components, capable of triggering a cascading blackout. In technical assessments, the M31 GMLRS, fired by HIMARS and MLRS rocket systems, stands out as the primary candidate. The reasoning is simple. Belgorod lies less than 40 kilometers from the front line, well within the M31 envelope. The pattern of compact craters and concentrated strikes on electrical nodes fits a single warhead, and the near-simultaneous strikes on multiple points match guided salvo tactics better than dispersed drone attacks, which are more vulnerable to wind, jamming, and air defenses. Although alternative hypotheses exist, the body of evidence favors clean, cutting strikes, exactly the kind that take transformers offline and cause a network to collapse. Compared with Ukrainian drones, which have evolved considerably, guided rockets offer greater payload, resistance to interference, and speed of systemic effect. If the attack signature points to munitions compatible with American platforms, the political message is addressed to Washington. Until 2024, there was a clear directive forbidding the use of US weapons on Russian soil to avoid escalation. In 2025, that line was recalibrated, allowing limited authorizations for containment strikes in border zones against targets linked to the war effort, with criteria to mitigate collateral damage and rapid approval mechanisms. In practice, that unlocked the GMLRS as an immediate denial tool, not to open strategic depth, but to make the short-term cost of striking Kyiv much higher. This shift carries clear operational and political implications. It eliminates the short-range sanctuary Moscow had been exploiting, accelerates the reaction cycle, and signals that the United States has adopted a calibrated offensive denial posture. The Kremlin reacted immediately in public. Dmitry Peskov accused Washington of direct involvement and warned that American assets that participate in or facilitate attacks on Russian territory could be considered legitimate targets. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian and American message was unmistakable. Attacking civilians in front of Kyiv will have a direct cost. In Washington, the message that the bill has come due was understood clearly. In Moscow, the sense of invulnerability near the border simply collapsed, and amid that landscape, Kyiv saw a rare opportunity to rebalance the board. It was in this environment that the figure of Donald Trump returned to the center. There were discreet attempts at mediation and even talks about a conditional ceasefire, but the sequence of Russian attacks on civilians and the Kremlin's refusal to accept any form of verification eroded any chance of an agreement. Rhetoric hardened, and behind the scenes, a leaked phrase summed up the moment: "American patience is running out fast." That was not an empty warning, but a signal that there was no longer room to tolerate unilateral attacks on Kyiv without Russia feeling a cost on its own territory. Within that context, President Zelensky made a direct request: access to Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Tomahawk is a long-range subsonic missile capable of flying low to the terrain to evade radars and guided by a hybrid system that combines GPS, INS, TERCOM, and DSMAC. It carries a high-explosive warhead capable of destroying command nodes, strategic depots, and even hardened energy infrastructure. In simple terms, it is a weapon with a range of hundreds of kilometers, meter-level accuracy, and flexible programming to navigate terrain, reference points, and approach routes. Unlike the GMLRS, which is a short blade used against nearby targets, the Tomahawk is a long arm, able to reach operational depths far beyond Belgorod. It opens the possibility of striking command centers, rail yards, missile hubs, and even interconnection substations that directly sustain the Kremlin's war effort. For the Americans, considering the supply of Tomahawks is not just a matter of releasing inventory. It involves calibrating rules of employment, delimiting authorized areas, defining target lists, and even creating political kill switch mechanisms in case escalation spirals out of control. Washington's assessment weighs two main factors: the immediate military effect of shortening Russia's attack chain and the risk that Moscow will respond asymmetrically outside the Ukrainian theater. Even so, after Belgorod, the balance shifted. If Russia insists on attacking civilians, Ukraine needs the ability to go beyond border depots. So what should be expected going forward? First, increasingly selective Ukrainian strikes into Russian territory aimed at critical dual-use infrastructure, substations that feed bases, ammunition transshipment yards, communications hubs, and fuel depots. Second, greater effectiveness in each attack cycle, with precision vectors released and Allied intelligence integrating windows of vulnerability. The time between identifying, deciding, and striking will shrink drastically. That means fewer massive barrages and more surgical strikes with disproportionate impact. Third, Russian dispersion. Moscow will be forced to break large hubs into smaller cells, reinforce electrical redundancies, and scatter depots, measures that raise logistical cost and reduce saturation capability. Finally, the Kremlin will continue to insist on the terrorist attack narrative for domestic consumption, while Kyiv underscores the fundamental difference between civilian targets, which Moscow has been attacking, and infrastructures that directly support the war effort, which have become Ukraine's principal targets. In practice, this new phase points to a costlier and more complex war for Russia. For Washington, the message is equally clear: the patience clock does not reset with speeches, but with changes in reaction capability. Belgorod was the warning. The next step, with or without Tomahawk, will determine whether that warning becomes the rule. This strike was not just another military response, it marks a turning point in the conflict. For the very first time, Russia felt on its own soil the same vulnerability it had been imposing on Ukraine. This counterattack symbolizes a new phase of the war, where Kyiv abandons a purely defensive posture and begins taking the fight beyond the border. Now, Moscow must deal not only with the human and economic cost of the invasion, but also with the threat of seeing its own infrastructure paralyzed in a matter of minutes. And the question that remains is, will Ukraine intensify these attacks, or will the United States impose new limits? Share your opinion in the comments. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more in-depth analyses about the future of this war and its global consequences. And if you want to understand why even voices inside Russia are starting to admit the war is lost, do not miss this video. Kremlin: voices betray Putin, declaring Russia's war is already lost. It shows how even the regime's most loyal propagandists can no longer sustain the narrative of victory.